certainly Indianapolis got the better of it because they do have all the precautions in place.
Football 24/7 with John McMullen, a special 15-minute broadcast across the JAKIB Media Sports Radio Network. Johnny Mac, the time has finally arrived. The trade has finally concluded where Carson Wentz is no longer officially a Philadelphia Eagle.
Yeah, pretty amazing, Krause, where we've come in really 20 months since the Eagles signed Carson Wentz to an extension, a 4-year, $128 million extension, the most guaranteed money at that point in NFL history. So that basically tells you this is our guy. This is going to be the starting quarterback at the Philadelphia Eagles for hopefully the next decade. And it just didn't work out that way. And here we are, snowing in the Delaware Valley. Seems like Groundhog Day, but it finally happened. And it kind of finally happened because the market just wasn't there for Carson Wentz after he derailed from a performance standpoint in the 2020 season. And we've talked a lot on Football 24/7 on the various platforms about Chris Ballard, Indianapolis GM, very shrewd guy. Wasn't going to overpay. And he kind of knew, Krause, he drew the inside straight because Carson wanted to be there. Frank Reich is there. Press Taylor is now there, his good friend. He trusts Frank. And he made it very clear through his representatives, the Tollner brothers, that that's where he wanted to play. Chicago was interested, probably would have given up a first-round pick, but he just didn't want to play there. And he made it clear to the Bears. So at that point, the Chicago said, we can't give you that for a guy who doesn't want to be here. So it was one team, and the Eagles end up getting a third-round pick this year and a conditional second-round pick in 2022 that can turn into a first-round pick if Carson plays 75% of the snaps or 70% and the Colts make the playoffs next season. And by the way, Joe, if they make the playoffs and Carson's playing well, they'll gladly give up a first-round pick because it'll be in the 20s. So it's a great deal for Indianapolis, and the Eagles kind of maximize what they could get in this market, which wasn't what anybody envisioned and wasn't the position they wanted to be in, if you're being completely honest.
John, let's talk about the money. Help me, help the listening audience understand the magnitude of the dollars and the dead cap and everything that is involved in this, because at the end of the day, that contract is still a staggering amount of money that, as you mentioned, Carson signed not too long ago.
Yeah, and it's staggering really from Philadelphia's standpoint. It's not staggering from Indianapolis' standpoint because the Eagles have paid so much money on it so far. So basically, we've talked about this number a lot, $33.8 million, which is the dead money that Jeffrey Lurie will be incurring for trading Carson Wentz. Now, a couple things. Remember, that money's already out the door. So it's just from a bookkeeping standpoint, it hurts you from a cap reality and the fact that this is the first time the NFL salary cap is going down due to the pandemic. So that further hamstrung the Eagles a little bit. But from the precedent standpoint, and this is the difficult part for Jeffrey Lurie, and I try to explain this to people, understand how precedents work in professional sports. And it's basically about timing, and things go up incrementally. And if you look at the dead money record, it was once $21 million for Brandon Cooks. Then it was $21.8 million for Antonio Brown. And then it just recently went up to $22.2 million for Jared Goff, the same player that was picked ahead of Carson Wentz in that 2016 draft. Now it's $33.8 million. So you can see they exploded that record, exploded it. They didn't want to do it. I guarantee you, Jeffrey Lurie's peers, his fellow owners, do not like it, because now other players will say, "Hey, Philadelphia did it. Why can't you do it?" So that is a very astute point by you. The Eagles were not only trading the player, they were trading this contract, they were trading this dead money, and that's why the value comes down a little bit. And talk of 2 first-round picks, it was never going to happen. Just wasn't going to happen.
John, who really was holding all of the cards in this poker match? Because I almost feel as though at the end, right up until the point that the deal was made, the guy holding all the cards was Carson Wentz.
Well, he had a big part. He had more leverage than people understood, because I got a lot from fans during this process. Who cares what Carson wants? Carson wants, just trade him. Just trade him for the most value. Just trade him to the Bears for that first-round pick. And what I try to explain is the fact that first-round pick from the Chicago Bears didn't exist unless Carson Wentz was willing to go to Chicago, embrace Chicago, want to be there. Because think of it from Ryan Pace, that's their GM, and Matt Nagy, their head coach. Think about it from their standpoint. They don't want a guy who doesn't want to be there. So when Carson made it clear that it was Indianapolis for him or bust, so to speak, it hurt the Eagles. There's no question about it. And the fact that he didn't want to go to Chicago and made it clear he didn't want to go to Chicago was part of that inside straight. I said that was dealt to Chris Ballard. He knew that. Chris Ballard knew it. He's negotiating with the same agent. He understands that Chicago's not really in this, despite the talk in the media and the rumors around the league. Chris Ballard knew better than anybody else that Carson Wentz wanted to be in Indianapolis. And he knew he had all the leverage. And to be honest, he probably gave the Eagles more than he had to with that conditional second-round pick that could have turned into a first. He probably could have made it just a second-round pick and really played hardball. But he put those sort of safety nets, as I mentioned. If Carson performs and the Colts make the playoffs, he has no problem giving up a pick in the 20s. That's fair value, and that's sort of the relationship you have as a fellow general manager. You're willing to give up some value if a player performs, and that sort of keeps the goodwill, so to speak. Colts and Chris Ballard did a tremendous job here, and he had every advantage, and he took advantage of that. And you expect GMs to do that.
Football 24/7 with John McMullen. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll find John McMullen all over the dial, all over the digital landscape. You'll hear a lot on his radio show coming up on Saturday on AM 1490 Sports Betting Radio, Extending the Play. Don't miss that 1 hour, 60 minutes of the story. John, I'm sure we'll be talking about the Wentz trade to the Colts for, at least the next month or 2 months or so before we get into draft talk, and then we'll talk about Carson again. And I almost feel as though with that statement, not a lot has changed for the Eagles because it was evident Carson wasn't coming back. Now, maybe this ultimately will affect, I guess this ultimately will affect what they do, because the next question is Jalen Hurts the starter?
Yeah, and I think it is. It puts in play quarterback at number 6 overall. And remember, the Eagles now have added draft capital. So it's always about evaluation with players, Krause. So I mean, if they look at Justin Fields, for instance, and they say, well, this guy's got a chance to be a superstar quarterback in this league, you almost have to do everything you can to try to get that player. So he's unlikely to fall to 6, but maybe you can move up to 3 or 4 and are able to draft him. You know, I go back to 2016 when the Eagles got Carson Wentz, and one thing Howie Roseman said, when you're up this high in the draft, you have to take advantage of it when it comes to the quarterback position. So they're in that same position, not quite as high, but in a similar spot. And they didn't want to have to turn it over this quickly, but they have to, and they have to look at that's the most important position. We all understand that, and you have to take advantage if you're up there. So if they like Justin Fields, if they like Trey Lance, you almost have to take a quarterback, Krause. Nothing against Jalen Hurts, but he was the 53rd pick in the draft for a reason. He doesn't have the skill set of those guys who are expected to go in the top 10. So it completely changes the landscape of the draft. And, you know, for Carson Wentz, I do want to say one thing, Krause, and that, you know, if you go back to 2017 and you go back to 11-2, he got this team the number 1 seed. So at the end of the day, while people have tremendous angst and it didn't work out for as long as we expected, hey, first Lombardi trophy in franchise history. He was a big part of that.
John, when I listen to your thoughts and comments and then your reference there about Jalen Hurts and who he is as a quarterback, I still find myself confused because now I ultimately wonder, well, why did they fire Doug Pederson? Was it because they knew Carson Wentz we'd ultimately get to this point?
I don't think they fired Doug Pederson because of Carson Wentz. I think it was pretty clear. Remember, if you go back to after the season, the assumption was how he did his season-ending press conference right next to Doug on Zoom. The assumption was that Doug would be back as the head coach of this team, and then as he continued to have his season-ending meetings for Jeffrey Lurie, he put together his plan for moving forward. A big part of that plan was elevating Press Taylor to offensive coordinator, elevating Matt Burke to defensive coordinator. Jeffrey did not like that. And I think his plans of the coaching staff and how he wanted to move forward in that part of this equation was ultimately what got him fired. And I think that was a mistake by Jeffrey Lurie. And the assumption that he fired him to smooth things over to the Carson Wentz was never true, and that was made clear by the fact that, look, Carson Wentz wanted out because he was upset at the organization. Now, he was upset about Doug Pederson benching him, no question about that, but that's part of the organization. And it wasn't just Doug Pederson. He was upset at Howie Roseman. He was upset at Jeffrey Lurie, and we are where we are, and that's with Carson Wentz in Indianapolis.
Last thought from John McMullen here on Football 24/7. We promised you 15 minutes of reaction from John McMullen. You'll get a lot more throughout the day and the rest of the week into the weekend. And then in the foreseeable future, we'll continue to talk about Carson Wentz now being traded and reuniting with Frank Reich in Indianapolis. The winner, John, who's the winner? Who's the loser? Is it the Colts and Carson? The Eagles are the stone loser. How do you see it?
Well, I think you have to look at as far as the actual trade. I mean, certainly Indianapolis got the better of it because they do have all the precautions in place. And, hey, we mentioned the contract, and the Eagles were trading not only the player but also the contract, and that took down the value of it, and Jeffrey Lurie has to eat that $33.8 million, has to set a precedent he didn't want to have to set. So it basically came down to the very end where everyone knew the page had to be turned. The Eagles did the best they could, but the best they could is a far cry from where we are. As I said 20 months ago, they declared Carson Wentz the face of this franchise, the starting quarterback for the next decade, and it just didn't work out when they signed that extension.
And if Jalen Hurts is not your franchise quarterback, and the trade now opens up draft conversation about drafting your next franchise quarterback, and you've spent $100+ million 20 months ago to sign your franchise quarterback, fire your Super Bowl winning head coach, and ultimately blow up the franchise to start all over again. Man, John, I've got to tell you, that is very, very hard to understand why. Like, I don't get it, dude.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are at that position, and you talk about the recent history and how things quickly move. And we often joke about the lifetime dispensation card that Doug Pederson earned by winning a Super Bowl. Turned out it could last 3 years. 3 calendar years. So, yeah, things move quickly. But from the Eagles' standpoint, you have to look at it as, if you make a mistake, what's the first step to solving it? And that's admitting it. And they admitted it today, and now they're moving forward. And Jeffrey himself has used the term transition to describe this team because nobody wants to use the term rebuild. But, maybe having a young coaching staff grow with a young roster to turn this entire thing over, maybe that's the way to go. Maybe it works out, but it's certainly the Eagles' plan. And they basically said, we made a mistake, we got to move on, and that's what they did today.
John, one last thing before I let you go. If you could summarize for everybody listening in to Football 24/7 right now, the crux of the deal of the trade, and the language and some of the logistics of the contract as it stands right now, to the best of your knowledge, as you know it.
Well, I think the key part is the future potential first-round pick from the Eagles' perspective. And again, that comes into play if Carson Wentz is successful in Indianapolis. And that's the safety guard Chris Ballard put in from the Colts standpoint. And if he plays 75% of the snaps or 70% and the Colts make the playoffs, the Eagles get a first-round pick. As I said, if the Colts are a playoff team, they'll gladly hand over a pick in the 20s to the Eagles for that type of quarterback play, because that's what you're looking for in this league. And from that standpoint, it's a little bit disappointing, I think, for the Eagles that they couldn't get a little bit more than that. But the crux of it, Krause, comes down to the Colts gave Carson Wentz 3 months to prove he's a starting quarterback. Because if he plays the way he played this season, and the Colts are a bad football team, they're just going to bench him and not give that first-round pick to the Philadelphia Eagles. So basically, the crux of it to me is Carson Wentz has 3 months in Indianapolis, the place where he wanted to go, to prove he can still be a top-shelf starter in the NFL. It's
an 11-win football team there, though, Johnny, from this past season. I've got to believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I've got to believe they think Carson will be the Carson that Philadelphia fell in love with. Yes?
Oh, yeah. They wouldn't have traded for him if they didn't think he could get back to at least the 2018, 2019 level of the quarterback. You mentioned, yeah, they're a playoff team. But, Phillip Rivers played at a pretty high level in his last NFL season. So you can go from playoff team to pretty bad, to 6 or 7 wins if you don't get good quarterback play. And that's, I think, was an important part of this deal from the Colts' perspective, is to put in that safety net in case things go poorly. They can just move on and go to the next option. And that's what things look like from their perspective. So Carson's going to have to perform. And as I said, he's going to have that essentially 3 months, 12 games. And it's going to be clear after 12 games Are the Colts a good team, or are they a bad team? If they're a bad team, they'll just pull the plug on Carson Wentz.
Football 24/7 with John McMullen. Well done, Johnny Mac. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Krause.